Hey everyone, it's Carissa Wiley here for Pinkfresh Studio. Thanks for joining me today. Today I am sharing a gingerbread house idea featuring the brand new Built on Dreams stamp set and coordinating layering stencils. I think this is so adorable, and I was thinking about ways I could use it for the holidays, and I thought about doing some red and green flowers inside the house, but then I came up with the gingerbread idea. So I'm going to be using this stamp set along with some brown inks from Pinkfresh Studio and some brown cardstock. Now, ideally, if I would have had a darker brown cardstock, I would have started with that, but I didn't. And so I'm going to just ink blend to make this look more gingerbready. So I wanted to show you that this stamp, it is very easy to distort it if you are just picking it up and moving it around. So I used the packaging, the printed packaging, to help me line that up to make sure that my house wasn't wonky. And then I closed the Misty lid over the top of that stamp. And then I had it in the perfect position to heat emboss on this craft colored cardstock. Now I am using Wow embossing ink for this, but you can use Versamark ink as well. And I did prep the surface of the cardstock with an anti-static powder tool prior to all of the inking and stamping. And that's going to be important as we go throughout this process today. Then I just used my heat embossing tool to melt all of that powder. And now I can start lining up the layering stencils and adding that to this little house. So I'm going to go in order here. So this is stencil 1, and I prepped the surface of this cardstock again with my anti-static powder tool. And I am using an ink blending tool, a foam ink blending tool, to press some Versamark ink into the open areas of the stencil. And I am just making sure that I get plenty of ink down through that stencil, because the stencil does create kind of a lip between the cardstock and the stencil itself. So you want to make sure that you have something that has a little give, like a foam ink blending tool, to press that ink into the openings. Then I took this over, I removed the stencil, and I added my white embossing powder to that inked area, and I heat set that. And then I'm going to work my way through all of the layering stencils and layer these up. So I am adding my second stencil here, but first I'm going to prep the surface with my powder tool. Then once again, I am just using my ink blending tool to press that Versamark ink into the open areas of the stencil. Once I have that all inked up, then I will take this over. I will add more embossing powder, and then I will heat set that again. Now, I am being very careful not to re-melt the previous powder. So I actually have my heat tool on the low heat setting, because this has 2 heat settings with this Wow embossing tool, and I use the low setting. Now I've worked my way through the stencils, and I'm on the very last stencil here, and it just adds a couple little hearts coming out of the chimney and to the design, this floral design on the house. And I'm just gonna melt that. And now I have my adorable stenciled and stamped house, and I'm gonna take the coordinating die and die cut that out. Now, because of the cardstock that I used, it doesn't look very gingerbread-like right now. So I'm going to do some ink blending to remedy that. And I am just pressing this onto a little sticky mat that I keep in my Misty stamping tool. And this is going to get ink on it, but that's not bothering me one bit. I'm just going to clean it off with some warm soapy water later, and it might be a little stained, but that doesn't bother me. I'm taking and I'm blending on some dough ink from Pinkfresh Studio. And then I'm going to wipe the extra ink off the surface of the embossing powder between each of these colors. So I've blended the dough all over this house. And now I'm coming in with Gathered Twigs, which is just a little bit darker. And I'm blending that in from the edges and creating a darker edge. Now I'm going to blend that kind of, I don't know, maybe 2/3 of the way into this house. And then I'm going to wipe the surface once again. And I'm going to finish off with the Espresso ink from Pinkfresh Studio. It is the darkest of the browns. Now, I have to tell you that I was kind of wondering at this point, my white embossing powder had lost its brightness, because these inks are pretty dark and there's a lot of purple and red in them, and purples and red tend to stain a little bit more. So My embossing powder wasn't really super bright white, and I tried kind of wiping it down several times. I even tried spraying a little bit of rubbing alcohol on the surface of my rag and seeing if that would lift some of it off, and it didn't. So I tried to heat set this again and see if the vibrancy would come back, and I really did not want to stencil this thing again. But I was feeling like I said, like the embossing powder had lost its brightness. And so I kept working on the card, and I was thinking about ways that I could maybe do this differently and come out with a different result. And while I'm thinking through that, I'm taking a piece of pink cardstock and I'm blending on some Ballet slipper ink and some coral reef ink to create an ink blended kind of panel. Now, ink blending on a colored cardstock makes ink blending really nice because you're not starting out with white, so you're starting out with a little bit of color on the cardstock as it is, and then you're just building color on top of that. Now I die cut it with this plaid cover plate from Pinkfresh Studio to kind of add that holiday feel. And then I grabbed this sentiment from the Thrill of Hope hot foil plate. I already had that made, so I decided to use that on my card today. Now, my daughter said this didn't really look like a gingerbread house. Totally. She thought there should be a bite mark out of it. And so I grabbed this little scallop circle from Pinkfresh Studio and I did a little partial die cut on the edge to create what looks like a little bit of a bite mark out of this gingerbread house. And then I die cut 2 more houses from this craft cardstock and just kind of trimmed away that area so that I could stack these up and add a little dimension to this house. Now, it really was bothering me. It really was. The staining of the embossing powder was bothering me. And it took me a little time to do the house to begin with, but I decided that it was worth trying another method. And so I'm kind of like working my way through this card, but feeling a little like I might want to redo this. So I'm just going to emboss this from Our Home to Yours sentiment onto some craft cardstock, heat emboss that in white. And then I am going to go through and trim this into a little banner. And then I'm going to start my house over. And I did it a little differently the second time around. And quite honestly, I'm not sure which result is better. I really thought maybe the second result was better. But when I go back and look at it, my embossing is not as clean on the second house as it was on the first. And that's because I die cut this house first and then did my ink blending and then stenciled on top of it. Now, because this ink is going to stay wet for quite a while, it's going to grab embossing powder. And I knew that it would do that. So I did ink blend this house and then I went in and I heat set this with a heat tool. But in the end, I still had some areas where the embossing powder kind of stuck to areas that I didn't want it to. So here's the ink blended house. I'm going to heat set that, and then I'm going to do the stenciling and the stamping on top. Now on my first house, the little areas that kind of come out of the chimney weren't perfectly lined up. So I did that stenciling and embossing first, and then I stamped the outline, and then I went through all of the other stencils, adding the ink through the stencil just like I did before, prepping with a powder tool. But like I said, there were still some areas where my embossing wasn't quite as clean, but I did end up using the second house on my finished card project instead of the first. So you can decide which method works better for you. And I'm sure there's even a different order I could have done this in to get a cleaner look. And if I would have had some darker brown paper to start with, I wouldn't have had to put so much ink on the top of it. And I think that would have made a difference as well. So you can see the second one is in my right hand. The first one is in my left hand. I ended up going with the second one. I went ahead and die cut that little scallop circle from the corner once again to create my bite mark. And then I added my foiled sentiment and my heat embossed sentiment below that. Now, you cannot have a gingerbread house without some candy on it, right? So I took some Pinkfresh Studio jewels and added those to my house to create some candy-like embellishments. And I mounted this house onto that plaid panel that I created earlier and mounted that entire thing with foam adhesive onto a top folding A2 size card base. And that finishes off my gingerbread house today, featuring the brand new Built on Dreams stamps, stencils, and dies from Pinkfresh Studio. And I think this is a really fun and different way to use this little house die. So let me know in the comments below, do you think this looks like a gingerbread house? I do, and I think it's adorable. As always, I will have links to the featured products used in this project in the description at YouTube. So if you're looking for something in particular, be sure you check there. And thank you so much for stopping by and hanging out with me today. Thank you for watching. I'm so glad you're here. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notifications here on this YouTube channel so you don't miss any of the paper crafting and card making video tutorials shared here. Thanks again for stopping by, and until next time, I hope you have a fabulous day.